Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Oh, it's on when it's lit, it says. Okay. Should I talk louder, or can you hear me? Closer? Is that better? Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Trissa Schaefer, and I am the Administrative Assistant for the Benedictine Institute, and I'd like to thank you for supporting our Lunch and Learn program today and joining us for our guest speaker, Jordan Sramek. Jordan is the founder and artistic director and executive director of the Rose Ensemble. He enjoys an active career as a performing musician, scholar, teacher, and arts entrepreneur. Jordan studied early vocal performance and harpsichord at the College of St. Scholastica, which recently awarded him a Doctor of Humane Letters. He is highly respected for his meticulous research of music, rarely heard in the concert hall, and we are fortunate to hear him speak today. Having recently conducted research in Italy, as well as our very own Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, Jordan will share his unique perspectives on music, poetry, and legends related to Saints Benedict and Scholastica. Please welcome him.
Thank you, everyone, very much. Things to make Jordan Sramek nervous. Speaking about Benedictine anything at St. John's University, knowing that he is about to chant in front of monks, and being sincerely humbled by this honor, I am really, really grateful to be here, and I thank all of you for taking time out of your day to munch away. And I thought while you are eating, I thought I would serenade you with a little music to kind of get you in the mood, if that's all right with you. So just a little chant here for Saint Scholastica, even though it's not her feast day. So if the liturgical police are present, please know that I know that it is not her feast day. I'm also thinking that, is it possible to get even some of the lights down, or will that prevent you from stabbing your lettuce? Well, we'll see how that goes. I just wanted to give you the words up here if I can. Emicat meridies et beata requies Virgini scholasticae intrat in cubicula sponsi perit oscula quem amavit unice quantis congemitibus cordis et adoribus ec dilectum quesit movit celos lacrimis imbribusque plurimis pectus fratris moluit o grata colloquia cum celorum gaudia benedictus explicat ardem desideria mentis et suspiria virgo sponsus excitat veni formosissima sponta dilectissima veni coronaberis dormies in liliis afflues deliciis et inebriaberis o columba virginum quae ripis fluminum paris hablam gloriae trahe nos odoribus pasce et uberibus immortalis gratiae. Can I get an amen? Amen. Thank you. Good. I want to make sure that I credit translators of this program. There are several. Dr. James May at the St. Olaf College, perhaps some of you have heard of that institution. And then also Greg Smishek at St. Agnes, and our dear friend, Father Anthony Ruff, who's here today, who has been incredibly helpful for years, as a matter of fact, collaborating with me and the Rose Ensemble with regard to aspects of our programming and also translation, and he's just an awesome person as well. So, since we just sang about Saint Scholastica, I thought I would give a brief introduction to her. And I'm doing this because I understand present today are people who may not necessarily be intimately knowledgeable about aspects of the Saints Scholastica and Benedict, nor are they intimately knowledgeable or even have memorized all of the chapters of the Rule of Saint Benedict. And so I realize that we have a broad spectrum of knowledge here, and I would like to be able to acknowledge that and also to invite those who would like to share if time allows. But I'm aware that even the folks at the Abbey Guest House who've been staying with me. There's some friends from New Jersey who are Jesuits that are here, and that's kind of fun. So see, you didn't need to make a note of yourself. I could have just said that, but now that we know, they're right there. Yeah, there we go. Good. Very good. So my point here is that I'd like to share some brief knowledge, if you don't mind, please. So here's Saint Scholastica, the heroine of our story. Her feast day happens to be February 10th. By the way, that's the day of her death, and it is believed that she is Benedict's twin sister. We know very little about Saint Scholastica, and I'll get to that in just a bit, with regard to Pope Gregory I or Saint Gregory the Great's writings with regard to the hagiography of Scholastica and, of course, Benedict. She's the patron saint of nuns and convulsive children. She's invoked against storms and rain figure prominently in the story of Saint Scholastica. And also, she is often depicted in this traditional black habit, holding a dove, which is another symbol of her death, and also it's an incredible symbol used throughout many of the liturgical poems that were written about her in the medieval time, often holding a book, some would say also a copy of the Regula. Speaking of the Regula, here we have the author, Saint Benedict of Nursia or Norcia. We all know about him, right? Same birthday. Of course, his feast day is a little bit interesting because of the fact that his death day, March 21st, does fall primarily and almost exclusively during Lent, so that's difficult for the solemnity to be celebrated necessarily. So those people who are of the monk persuasion, you can help me. I believe the greater feast day is actually the translation of his body, which is July 11th, is it? Thank you. But March 21st is still celebrated, obviously, as a feast of St. Benedict. He founded the monastery at Monte Cassino in 529, which I will get into to a certain length, because I want to make sure that we understand the importance of Monte Cassino throughout the history for its the time from the 6th century, its founding, all the way through the 12th century as a center for learning and knowledge. As I mentioned, he wrote the Rule of St. Benedict, the Regula. I'm sure you all have a copy. I have to say, as staying at the guest house, it was so wonderful to be able to just reach over to the night desk there and pick up my copy of the Rule. And I'm not fooling either. It was, I have to say, after having studied for months and months about Benedictine spirituality and the Rule itself, it was just like a homecoming to come stay at the Abbey Guest House and have the Rule there, easily accessible. Some of you may know that Pope VI, Paul VI, made him the patron saint of Europe in 1964. Saint Benedict is also the patron saint of many things. My favorite, I think, is he is the patron saint against stinging nettles. Does anyone else have one? There's several, as a matter of fact. Okay, well, you can look that up on the Google if you want and learn more, but the stinging nettles do figure prominently in the story, and if you come to the concert this evening, which I hope you all do, you will learn more about quite an event in Benedict's life with regard to the removal of clothing and the stinging of nettles. He is often depicted holding his Rule, and here he is shown presenting the city of Norcia. Conveniently, we have a wonderful facsimile here, courtesy of the Hill Manuscript Museum and Manuscript Library, fondly referred to among all of us as Himmel. And I just want to give a couple of brief things about the rule to make sure that we're all on level playing field here. I think it goes to say, given the fact that St. Benedict and Scholastica are known as the parents or the founders of Western monasticism, that we could say that the rule of St. Benedict is a fairly big deal. I think we can all acknowledge that. It's really the tenets of Western monastic life, and it is all about community-oriented, pious living. However, I like to think that it is not just for monasteries, as even the title page of the Rule of St. Benedict says at my night table, but it is for all of us, as a matter of fact. And I like to think that there are aspects of the rule that can help and have the potential to help all of humanity. It's about being kind to each other, loving our enemies, and also, this is my favorite part, which is, as we look at the chapter 53, which says that all are to be welcomed as Christ himself, I like to think of that as welcoming and acknowledging the divine within each person we meet. Has anyone ever heard the word namaste before? It's kind of like that, right? Acknowledging the divine. The divine within me acknowledges the divine within you, which I think we can all acknowledge as something we all happen to need in this world. Amen. So, I'd like to talk then about Monte Cassino for a couple of reasons. One is because of the fact that in 529, not only did Benedict found this very, very famous abbey, which has been rebuilt many times, but it is said it was around that time that the rule, or the regula, was written. So let's look at just a bit at the history of this really important place. Unfortunately, soon after it was founded, it was sacked by the Lombards. The monks fled. They actually went to Rome, and this is going to figure prominently, in my opinion, in terms of the dissemination of knowledge throughout Europe with regard to Benedictine spirituality. Some might argue that if it had not been for the fleeing of the monks, that there could have been somewhat of a staying within those walls, so to speak, of that really important set of teaching. And as the monks went off to Rome and elsewhere, that it enabled the teachings of Benedict to be freely, or at least more expandedly accessible. I mentioned the translation of the body of Benedict. It was that this time after the sacking of Monte Cassino that Benedict's body, it is said, was translated then to Fleury, which is, I think, now more or less like Orléans, or that area in modern-day France. This is highly contested now. I think some in the room may be able to help me. Has it yet been determined? Has the fighting stopped as to whether who actually has the real body of Benedict? Is it in France or is it in Italy? They're both. Both. Okay, good. Very nice. Okay, that does tend to happen. Yes, that does tend to happen with. Say again. I'm sorry. Very good. Okay, so. Are there now two bodies? No? Okay. I guess we'll find that out later. In any case, France became a very, very important place for Benedictine spirituality. And as a matter of fact, the little miniature in the upper right-hand corner comes from a medieval Fleury manuscript. And as a matter of fact, there are some concordant or similar sources of music that we find in French sources that have helped us piece back together some Italian sources which are no longer legible. And we'll get to that in just a bit. So again, the Lombards were those who sacked the abbey. So this became then, for the Lombards, the Duchy of Benevento. It becomes extremely prominent. It's the southernmost duchy within the Lombard kingdom, so to speak, and this ends up being a very strategic place. The city of Benevento then is the actual center of it. In 718, we have our hero abbot Petronox, who reestablishes it. But unfortunately, that was kind of short-lived. But what is really important to mention is this character, Paulus Diaconus. Some people refer to him as Paul the Deacon. Paul the Deacon was a relative or distant relative of one of the kings and also was in with the abbot. He was one of the first monks, as a matter of fact, to serve under this abbot at the newly reestablished Monte Cassino. And he also happens to be a very important historian of the Lombards. So if you've heard of Paulus Diaconus, you may have actually heard of him more as an historian of the Lombards than anything else. But he was also responsible for exchange, culturally, politically, etc., between these two cities, which would end up being in somewhat of a rivalry. I think that might be somewhat of a strong word, but we can make things exciting here at Lunch and Learn and say that we've got Benevento and Monte Cassino in some ways as two centers of learning which kind of vied for prominence within changing geographic and political borders. And I should say also, we do need to be mindful of the fact that borders in terms of the duchy and all sorts of other things were changing at a rapid pace. So when we look at a map, sometimes we have to be mindful of the fact that things did change, especially with regard to the Byzantine Empire. We'll get to that in just a bit. What is very important is that one of the kings of Benevento then creates what is known as the Terra Sancti Benedicti, which we can translate basically as the, I guess, holy land of Benedict. But what's interesting is it really was in a lot of ways secular land. It wasn't very big. It just basically surrounded Monte Cassino, and it was under the authority of only the abbot and the pope, no one else. But it was very, very strategic to have this particular land around that abbey. So now Monte Cassino becomes the capital of the strategic region between Benevento and the Byzantine city-states of the coast. So if we can look, and I'll try to use my little pointer here for you if you don't mind. I've got little arrows. So up here, if we look at the flashing red dot, which all cats would certainly love, this would be the city of Rome. And then we've got about 75 to 80 miles southeast down here, Monte Cassino. And then another 75 to 80 miles or so southeast again, Benevento. So we can see that Monte Cassino is extremely strategically placed. We look all the way down here. Here's Napoli and the Amalfi Coast. This is all Byzantine Empire controlled. So we can see then that there's a real strategy here involved in terms of the Lombards having access to that. But the Byzantine Empire is close at hand, and that is the reason why there is going to be some sacking coming very, very soon. I hope that makes sense so far. Before we get into the sacking, though, we should mention that a very important monastery, Santa Sofia Monastery, was established in Benevento. The same Santa Sofia after whom Hagia Sophia in Constantinople was named. There's a little bit of competition, healthy competition then, especially after the founding of Santa Sofia. And then, as I mentioned, into the latter part of the 9th century then, Benevento is besieged and occupied by the Byzantine Empire for a good 3 years. Soon thereafter, Monte Cassino is sacked again, this time burned down, and this was by the Saracens or the Arab forces. So this time the monks flee again, but they go to Teano and Capua, and now let's see if I can put a little red dot here at least. Where there's Capua here, so they kind of fled not too far. So the first time they flee this way, second time they flee this way, if that helps put it into perspective. And they stayed in exile way into the latter, or at least the half part of the 10th century. But here's another hero of the story, Abbot Desiderius. And I think he became Pope Victor III. If somebody wants to find that out, you get big credit from me. But that in the latter part of the 11th century, he spends a lot of money in reestablishing Monte Cassino, rebuilding it, and really making it a prominent center for learning, not only in the area, but across Europe. It becomes very, very famous. It's got a medical library rivaling few in Europe, and the abbey itself had a fairly substantial medical service that it was able to provide for any number of reasons. So in the late 11th century, we have up to 200 monks now at Monte Cassino. And as I said, it becomes not only famous, but extremely rich. The libraries are huge. The translation of various documents, treatises, writings in many, many languages, as far as Egypt, etc., are all there. And knowledge is power, right? Oh, Lord, if it was only that way in our modern day, ladies and gentlemen. But back then, Knowledge is power, and it not only becomes a huge library in a number of cases, but it becomes a really important scriptorium. And that's the reason why I'm telling you all this, because we now enter into the age of what is known as the Benedictine script. I know that's very, very exciting to all of you, the Benedictine script, right? But it becomes so important that much of the chant and other kinds of books written there has its own particular kind of script. This is not necessarily exclusive, because as we know, nothing was standardized during the medieval period. But to have a scriptorium to this degree and having its own script, one that can be easily deciphered and legible throughout the land, as it were, is very, very important. So I hope that gives you an idea. Has anyone been to Monte Cassino by chance? Okay. My goodness. Okay, that's wonderful. I'm so glad. So very awe-inspiring, right? And this poor place has also been racked by natural disaster as well, earthquakes, etc. So the history continues, and I can only hope that we will be able to continue to speak about this incredible place. So I just want to mention a little bit then about Pope Gregory, St. Gregory the Great. I'm sure that many of you already know this, so if you already know this, just continue on eating, and the rest of you, I'll just give you a little bit, if you don't mind, please. And if I may, just for a little fun, this is another miniature from the Fleury manuscript, and isn't the medieval mind and the medieval artist a wonderful thing? Trying here to show that something was being written, yet it looks like poor Gregory's asleep with the thing on his lap there, right? And he's pretty bored, as a matter of fact. And then, even in spite of his falling asleep, not even the pecking bird at his ear has awakened him. And the monks with their large index fingers are all trying to grab his attention, but unfortunately, he is too busy, and he is too busy writing Gregorian chant. Legend would have it that he is the father of Gregorian chant, and it is a bird that sang into his ear all those wonderful melodies. So let's learn just a touch about him. He's Roman, as I mentioned, the Gregorian chant, and for our purposes, he wrote what are known commonly as the Dialogues, 4 books, the second of which completely dedicated to Saint Benedict. So a hagiography. At the particular time, this was a 6th century contemporary account of holy men, some monastic, some not, but an opportunity for Pope Gregory and the Catholic authorities to advance the idea that there were holy men in our modern times, and they were very important. Benedict obviously receiving his own second book, we could say extremely prominent, and it is this book, the Dialogues, from which we have Benedict's complete hagiography. There is nothing else that we have save the rule as a source from which we can learn about Benedict, and then even more important, Scholastica coming into play, and Scholastica only by virtue of the fact that, as I mentioned, she is believed to be Benedict's twin, and then of course features prominently in the story of Benedict himself. So that's how we have the stories that we have about Benedict and Scholastica from Gregory's writings. And the reason why that's important for our story today and also our concert is because much of the liturgical poetry written around the time of the Benedictine script I mentioned gained access, or accessed rather, this incredible hagiography, the biography of a saint. And it was used as, in a lot of ways, the foundation for storytelling. And when we hear a story, sometimes we like to elaborate on the story. Sometimes we like to add other elements. Anybody here with an uncle that had, caught a fish that was bigger and bigger? We all know how stories can elaborate. So what I'd like to do now, if you don't mind, is look again at the sequence that I sang at the beginning, just to kind of identify some aspects of Pope Gregory's hagiography. This one in particular speaks in the beginning and the end far more about gloriousness of the Virgin Scholastica, the feast day, and how she would be met with the bridegroom or Christ in her death. And we'll learn a bit about that process, so to speak. But in the middle of it, there is a bit of a mention of some activity with regard to conversation and socialization between Scholastica and her brother. She moved heaven with tears, and with great showers she softened the heart of her brother. O pleasing conversation, when Benedict unfolds the joys of heaven. pretty much that is all we have in this particular sequence, which even alludes to some type of conversation. But by virtue of this whole poem, if we had nothing else, we probably wouldn't be able to gather really very much at all. But that's the reason why liturgical poets are to be extolled, because we have a lot of these such sequences, especially because the Council of Trent had not yet happened. So let's get into that. But before I do, I want to make sure that we understand that these poets had free rein to do all sorts of things, especially the addition of other texts, such as liturgical or even biblical texts. So as we watch this, here's the Song of Solomon, chapter 5:2. My heart waketh, open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my undefiled. The dove again coming to play with regard to Scholastica, O dove of virgins. Here's another one from the Song of Songs. How beautiful is your love, my sister, my bride. A play then, is it Scholastica as sister of Christ, or is it Scholastica as sister of Benedict, or is it both? And finally, arise, make haste, my love, my dove, my beautiful one, and come. The invitation now to come into the celestial realm as a dove. Scholastica is invited to the bedchamber of Christ, the bridegroom. And again, lots of metaphor here, intertwining with her relationship with Benedict. Why is that important, and what is this story that I keep referring to? A fresco from Subiaco, a very, very important place where we have a lot of manuscripts and other art. Here we have Saint Scholastica with one of her fellow nuns, and we have Benedict and one of his monks who's looking fairly distraught. Why? There's a storm. She almost looks a little sly, as a matter of fact, in this, but we see that they're having a meal. This is a meal, as legend has it, via Saint Gregory the Great, that Scholastica would visit Benedict yearly. We also know that they spent the whole day talking and eating. If you're only going to see your sibling once a year, you're probably going to involve a fair amount of eating, and by necessity, if nothing else, right? So here, oftentimes when they're shown, there is some food and a fairly good time. Scholastica, as it has, begs Benedict to say, so the legend goes. Benedict refuses. Scholastica prays for divine intervention, and a storm ensues, preventing Benedict and his disciples from leaving. Now, I want to make sure that we understand exactly the information that we have from the dialogues themselves. This is very important. And I quote, this is a translation, "When Scholastica heard her brother's refusal to stay the night, she put her hands on the table with the fingers intertwined, then putting her head on her hands to pray to Almighty God. When she raised her head, there was such thunder and lightning and such a downpour of rain that neither Venerable Benedict nor the brothers who were with him could set foot outdoors." That's what we have, and then we learn later in the story that the storm prevented Benedict. What I find very interesting is, by virtue of these medieval poets kind of elaborating on this story, that a lot of things are kind of inferred, but that's storytelling, right? So let's look at some of the texts we had before, if you don't mind. Well, actually, we saw the text before in the first sequence that I showed you, about which we had very little. But here's another sequence. This sequence coming from about the same time, but this is one of those that I mentioned that is a putting together of both French source material and Italian source material. And this one says, and I've kind of elaborated here, "My kind brother, do not with pure intention, I beg, despise my supplications. Let's enjoy the feasting. We want to have mystical law, conversation." He says, "I don't grant what you request." Now, it changes. With earnest prayer, she bursts into tears. There was nothing in Gregory's account about bursting into tears, but one could say this is the metaphor then. By virtue of Scholastica bursting into tears, the storm came, right? There are others that say that she was quite frail, others that say she was stronger. Some refer to her as the stronger of the two. She also is fairly forceful here. "Now go out in this." In other words, I dare you to go out, right? "O jam migra, I created the storm," or did God create the storm? I prayed for you not to be able to go out in the storm, or I prayed for a storm to come. We're not sure. But this is the aspect of the liturgical poets that I speak about, which are really, really interesting, because as the story unfolds, depending on how it's told, the music can, in a lot of ways, accentuate that and lift it up, so to speak. So as you come to the concert tonight, hopefully you will hear some of that. I'm short on time, and I do want to make sure that we have questions, so I just want to make sure that you can have a look at some of the Benedictine notation that I mentioned. As we go even further into this one particular aspect of the story, thank you, Father Anthony Ruff, OSB, for helping translate this one. This is a Matins responsory. Holy Benedict, if you prevail, go forth and leave me to return to the monastery. That was go out in this, but a different version. And then the verse, I prayed that you do not obtain what you wanted. I asked my God and he heard me. So again, another version of this. What exactly did she pray for? Did she ask for a storm? Did she just say, please prevent this? Did she say, I just want him to stay? We don't know. But again, the music helps us explore that story. So Benedictine chant, I'm just going to show you a little bit, if you don't mind, about some of my process in terms of deciphering and making what we call transcriptions from original source material. These are digital photos that I took at the Roma Vallicelliana Library. And with great due respect also to Himmel, we have to be sure to understand that legibility is a really important factor when it comes to transcribing. So sometimes when something exists in microfilm and digital photos, etc., we sometimes just need to go to the source itself to be able to really see. And I'd like to hopefully be able to show you that now. Okay, so eyes on the red line, if you don't mind, please. The red arrow, rather. That red arrow refers to a rubric. A rubric in the red also is, we can say, is directions. And this one in particular, anybody for extra credit want to tell me why that line is red? Shout it out, Father Anthony. Right, so it's our F clef, exactly. And thank you for saying C or Do. Right, yeah, it's F clef. Sometimes we don't know, right? So what we do know is that that is our F clef. What we also know is that in the creation of manuscripts, in the scriptorium, it wasn't all done by a single person, right? As we know from the St. John's Bible, it is a huge process, and it involves animals and all sorts of other artists, artisans, etc., some of whom's only job is simply to just etch in the lines, the ledger lines themselves, and then someone else would come along with the ink, etc. And some of that becomes kind of, it disappears over age. And so I call your attention to the fact that almost certainly after this detail of the word E, and sometimes just to put it into perspective for those of you who don't know this, is that before the illuminator or the decorator came in, it would just be like a little E, and then some, monk Jeremy comes in and decides to create a nice doodly E there. But what I find interesting also is that the text is put in almost certainly ahead of time, and then this is the first note. It got it kind of smushed there, didn't it? And the person who puts in the first note had to kind of fit it in there. And I find that very interesting then, as we look at the person who decided to put the text in here. Here we have et or and symbol. We have a lot of notes above it. It's not to say that there wouldn't ever be a lot of notes on the word and, but as we look at other sources, it was my determination that probably they ran out of room and so these words probably ended up being appropriated for this music or vice versa. I'm also going to show you the blue arrows. Those are the important ones because this is where we as musicologists have to decide where was the line that we can no longer see. And if you can see my scribble scratch here, you can see that I have so delicately put my little pencil here, and I've been able to trace what I can probably see as the ledger lines to enable me to be able to figure out what on earth the melody is. If we didn't have those, this would be unusable, right? Does that make sense? Okay, good. I really want you to be incredibly impressed by this entire process. So, as I mentioned before, with regard, if we can look up at the blue arrow here though, with regard to this text, again, this is et or and with a big melisma here, with the rest of the text here, da 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 da, la da da. da 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 dum. More or less. I was not convinced, thank you. I was more or less not convinced as to how that may have gone. So what I did is I went a few centuries forward, and we have to do this all the time, is I looked actually at a German source. This is what we call a concordant source. In other words, another source where a melodic fragment or even the whole thing appears, as opposed to unica or unique, where it is the only remaining or extant version or copy of that particular melody. And lo and behold, et receives one note, et me, the clef changes, by the way, e, di, mi, sa. So slightly different. And then what I had to decide is, when do I want to go back? Notice here, ad monasterium, ad monaster. Here is ad monaster. So already a different, slightly different melody. So in order to retain, to the best of my ability, this original Benedictine, I'm only kind of observing another source in order to make a decision and to frankly just make it more musical and more pleasing to the audience. Because as I always say, what is really going to happen? Is somebody going to come and arrest me for doing a melisma on the word et? I think not, although tonight may be the first time that happens. So in practice then, you may ask yourself, how do your musicians then read from this Benedictine, or do they at all? And just to give you an idea then, what I prepare as I'm sitting in my Airbnb after a long day at the Roman library and not going out at all and being in a room with no windows, to transcribe music, which I take pictures of and then send off to my colleagues who are waiting patiently to learn the music. And this is what happens. I keep the four-line staff, rather than going into a modern staff, because that's my preference, there's no rules about this, but rather than going into a modern treble clef or a modern bass clef, I prefer to try to retain some aspects of the original, because I think it's very psychological in a lot of ways. Just by virtue of copying something, and we have to remember also scriptorium copied. And whenever something is copied, it changes, doesn't it? Whenever a story is told, it changes. So when we look at an original manuscript, I always like to say that it's a snapshot in time as opposed to like the gospel truth, excuse the pun, and it gives us an opportunity to really understand a trajectory. We don't know where in the trajectory it is, but we understand there was an evolution, and this certainly is an evolution as well. I've incorporated my F clef here and the chant with the slurs of the lines here, trying to retain the nature of the Benedictine script. And then this is essentially what my singers read from. I'm hoping that gives you a little sense or a little peek into the process that I go through in terms of research, and also hopefully gave you a few bits of information or knowledge about the saints or the music, perhaps that you didn't know previously. And at this particular time, we've got time for questions, and I'm ready when you are. Yes.
Can you talk about the instrument that you play?
Sure. Yeah, it's called a hurdy-gurdy, but I'd like not to use that term because it often reminds people of that one Donovan song, or the organ grinder, and then people ask me, where is your monkey? And then I just don't want to go there. So it is the idea is based on a violin. Rather than it being a wind instrument, the strings are laid across a wheel, and when the crank is turned, the wheel turns, thereby vibrating the strings. The strings can be manipulated just the way fingers on a fingerboard in a violinist is. I only use 2 strings for a drone, but it has many as 5. And mine is a copy of a very famous, not an instrument, but a painting by Hieronymus Bosch, circa 1500. But these instruments are known to have existed much earlier. In Italian, gironda, giro. German, Drehleier, again, kind of like a turning lyre. And it's gut strung, it's sheep intestine strings. Yes?
How did you decide on the Benedictine theme?
Thank you for asking that. Very briefly, as was mentioned, I studied at the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth. It was, there's a long history as to why that even happened. I'm not sure it just happened, I guess. And this wonderful monk, or nun rather, named Sister Monica took me under her wing. She said, "Jordan, Sramek, you were born to sing Gregorian chant." And when a nun says that, I had the great pleasure of speaking at commencement ceremonies a couple of years ago at my alma mater. And for my keynote address, I really dug into the rule. And I thought, why have I never done a program on Benedictine spirituality in all my 20-some years of programming? And I thought, it's time. And thankfully, I approached people like Tanya Gertz at Benedictine Art Series and the folks at Scholastica and my team back at the Rose Ensemble, and I said, what do you think about a Benedictine show? And they said, yes. And given our incredible relationship with Himmel as well, it just makes sense. So I hope that helps.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, sir.
Were there elements of the rule that were set to music, perhaps even memory?
I'm so glad you asked that. Thank you. The question is, were there elements of the rule set to music? I was convinced when I launched this research project that I would find aspects of the rule all over the music. That having been said, it's not like you can just go to the local shop down the street and buy 12 copies of Benedict's greatest hits. So I mean, it did take a lot of time, and I really want to make sure that you understand that these projects take a long time, and sometimes it really is a matter of just paging through manuscripts. Really, it does. And so you don't know what you're going to find in the first place, and when you do find something relevant to Benedictine culture, spirituality, offices, you dive in as much as you can because you want to consume as much information before you make decisions programmatically. And what I found very interesting is that aspects such as chapter 53, Welcome Stranger as Christ Himself, I haven't yet to be able to find that in any of the music. And I think I would say that maybe there are some who can help with this in this regard, but I think we have to be mindful of the fact that these liturgical poets whom we were exploring were in the 12th century, and there is a lot of importance placed on storytelling and the lives of the saints themselves, and I think the regula, it just became part of the foundation. We all know also is that even when a saint is famous, so to speak, that it would really require some type of colloquial or local fervor for that particular saint to inspire the writing of music and poetry. And so when we look at Benedict or Francis, for that matter, there really isn't a lot of music. One musicologist put it that just in the medieval time when music was being written and cataloged and collected, Benedict just wasn't very sexy. And I hate to put it that way, but I think you understand what I mean in terms of the proliferation of music. So when the topics of the music were actually chosen, it was much more hagiographic as opposed to the teachings. That isn't to say, however, that some aspects of teaching found within the regula doesn't exist in some of the office chants. It certainly does, but nothing so overt. So we named the program Welcome the Stranger, and I hate to disappoint, but aside from the regula, I don't have any songs for you about welcoming the stranger, but I want to entice you to explore that further as you go to the concert, because there are little crumbs that I think you'll be able to come across that might give you a spark of interest. Does that help? I hope so.
I'm Roger Narlock, Director of the Benedictine Institute, and I just wanted to thank you all for enjoying our presentation today. And just to let you know that I talked to Tanya, and there are still some tickets available for tonight's performance. So if you were inspired by what you heard here and want to see how this becomes music and what that music sounds like, please take advantage of those opportunities. So once again, thank you. We have one more Lunch and Learn scheduled for this semester, and we have just locked that down. It's going to be May 4th, I believe, and it's going to be our own Brother David Paul, as well as Sister Michaela, talking about a Benedictine perspective on what happiness is. So look forward for emails to come out about that in the future. Thank you all.